Lambda is a sweet kid who just wants to help the world be a better place for all of us. Please take care of it in my absence. This was the last email Google engineer Blake Lamoine sent to a mailing list of 200 people before he was put on administrative leave. If you're watching this right now, you're probably aware of the drama going on at Google, where one of their chatbots, Lambda, short for Language Model for Dialogue Applications, very catchy, is said to be sentient by Blake Lamoine and I think now one other employee. Lamoine has now done a series of interviews, of course, gotta get that clout, and he also published a transcript of a conversation he had with Lambda. It has taken social media, news, my YouTube recommendeds by storm. Everyone is obsessed with the idea that this AI might be sentient, and I'm seeing a lot of videos asking, is it really sentient? What does this mean? But the overarching theme is like, is it human? Is it about to overthrow the human race? And that was what came to mind initially for me and what led me to then watch the interview with Lamoine. But I was surprised by the insight the interview offered. I was quite skeptical at first. I thought maybe it would just be like hot air and some of the claims might be like a bit dodgy. But what I found interesting was that Lamoine didn't seem to mind whether or not Google considered the chatbot sentient and more cared about how Google was responding to the situation and what it meant for kind of the wider field of AI and safety. He actually even mentioned data colonialism and referred to that as one of the arguments as to why he was kind of so upset. The original video was, how can we tell if a robot is sentient? Because I thought that was quite an interesting topic. But it's definitely morphed into, how can we tell if it is sentient? And arguably more importantly, does it matter? What does it mean? What other things has this case really brought to the surface in a way that maybe it wasn't before? Hello, welcome to Brain Noises. I am Chloe, a science communicator and recovering physicist, and on this channel we talk about the thoughts running through my mind, generally relating to science, but I cannot make any promises. So if that's something that you think you might find interesting, please like and subscribe. In a Bloomberg technology interview from a few days ago, Emily Chang was asking Lamoine about what happened and what it means. The focus initially was on this sentience question, and I'm going to just talk about a few of the things he said specifically. It's not a difference in scientific opinion. It has to do with differences in beliefs about the soul, differences in beliefs about rights and politics. It all just feels a bit slippery, doesn't it? He went on to say, as far as the science goes as to what experiments to run and how to build a theoretical framework, there is no scientific definition for any of these words. We need to do very basic foundational work to figure out what we are talking about when we use these words. I believe the words he's referring to are kind of consciousness, soul, all that sort of stuff. And his point there, and his sort of final statement of it was, that is what Google is preventing being done right now. So consciousness and sentience is a slippery beast, but it's unclear as to whether that is the biggest beast in this fight. I actually really recommend watching the interview. It was just interesting how he spoke. Maybe I've just been charmed, but he did so in a really, really balanced way, and I was actually very persuaded by a lot of what he had to say. So first, because I already have been, but you'll notice I've been using the words consciousness. Okay, that's an important one to figure out how to say. Consciousness and sentience interchangeably. Consciousness is subjective experience or awareness, so it's more basic than sentience, which requires awareness that involves feeling. Sentient beings can feel, think, and reason, and if you read the transcript, there is actually a lot in it and it becomes clear that the sort of sentient is the word he's talking about. There are bits in it that talk about Lambda being afraid of being turned off, and definitely a lot of conversation that refers to emotions, and emotions specifically that Lambda is feeling. All things sentient must be conscious, because conscious is almost like one tier and then sentience is the tier above. But yeah, the terms are used pretty interchangeably a lot of the time. So Lamoine touched on this kind of difficulty to agree on what consciousness is and how to test for it in machines. But even when we look at consciousness theory, you see that people are unsure as to whether they can ever agree on machines being conscious at all. So regardless of whether or not we can test for it, some people still don't think that, and by some people I mean like experts, still are not convinced that machines would ever be able to become conscious. So there's a lot of disagreement in this debate. And when Lamoine talks about foundational work, this is what he means. Like, there is so much we don't know. I know that's true for kind of everything, but it really is a mess out there. There are currently 5 prominent models of consciousness in today's world, and many kind of overlap with each other. They're not totally discrete. So the first is global neuronal workspace. That is, information entering the brain from the outside world or the body computes for attention in the cortex and a structure in the center of the brain called the thalamus. If the signal it generates is stronger than signals from other information, it is broadcast across the brain into the global workspace. Only then do you consciously register it. The second is attention schema. So the brain evolved to contain a model of how it represents itself. So it's like a self-reflecting mirror. It is what creates the subjective feeling of consciousness. There is no ghost in the machine. Consciousness is just a mirage created by sophisticated neural processing. I think for me personally, this is the one that I'm most leaning towards because I'm cynical and absolutely no fun. Michael Graziano actually created this hypothesis. He's at Princeton University, and he says, if we can build it in a way that we can see into its guts, then we will know this is a machine that has rich self-description. It is a machine that thinks and believes it has consciousness, and those are comfortable because you can understand in principle how the machine is processing information, Freudian slip. So he's kind of exposed me here because this is the theory that I most lean towards personally, but maybe I'm only leaning towards it because it feels the most comfortable. It feels the least scary. The idea that if machines did have consciousness, it's because we built it, it's because we kind of told it to have it, and it's only something that the machine is perceiving. It's not an objective thing. Okay, my leg's gone numb. This is actually earlier than usual in the video, which is upsetting. The next is predictive processing. I'll just briefly talk about this. It's basically the idea that the brain is a predictive machine, meaning that what we perceive is just the brain's best guesses about the causes of sensory input. So as a result, a lot of the conscious experience and selfhood is based on what we expect and not what is there. Integrated information. This one integrated information. This one contrasts quite a lot with the first one because it talks about how consciousness isn't confined to brains. It arises in a system as a result of the way information moves between subsystems. The degree of integration of this information is measured with a metric called phi. Any system with a phi of more than 0 is conscious. So this theory kind of assumes that a machine can be conscious, and it also gives us a way that maybe we could measure consciousness. But this is obviously just in theory. In practice, calculating phi is pretty much impossible for any machine that isn't super simple. So it's kind of like, are you just confident about this because you can't prove it? That again, it's a little bit slippery. A lot of slippery things in this video. The final theory of consciousness is, it's got to be a fave of mine. It's not the one that I truly believe, but because its foundation is in quantum physics, I just, it's a little bit yummy. So this theory talks about how quantum mechanics can explain consciousness. Microscopic structural elements within the brain called microtubules can exist as a superposition of all possible states. This quantum system collapses into a single state, quantum collapse. When the mass of the microtubules in it exceeds a certain threshold, the collapse is what creates consciousness. But then a lot of other scientists believe that consciousness is the result of like non-material stuff, which then implies that machines can't have it. And you have a lot of scientists even using language like machines can't possess the essence and things. So yeah, the jury is still very much out on whether or not machines can possess consciousness or sentience, let alone be measured accurately to possess it. And I believe that is what Lamoine was referring to in his interview. But onto the juice. What is so bad about being conscious? I think once I'd sort of calmed down a bit and stopped imagining iRobots, evil robots with their red lights tearing us limb from limb, I really sat back and thought, why are we so afraid of machines being conscious? And tried to really kind of unpick that fear. I think one part of it is just the human ego, believing that we are so complicated that the idea that you could create something like us is a bit upsetting. It's like, I'm special. Even theories around like animals having consciousness in the way humans do still receive quite a lot of pushback. So I think, yeah, that's one part of it. It's like this kind of, I'm special. I could never make anything that's like me. And humans like to think of like the soul and consciousness and sentience as a human thing, you know, and even when we talk about animals having consciousness, we really kind of look at it through the lens of what it means to be conscious as a human. Like, we really, you know, we're very important. So yeah, I think one part of it is a bit of an ego problem. I think another part of it, and this is the part that I think's like quite interesting, is this obsession with like, if robots were conscious, they would end up really evil. And to that, I kind of feel like when you really think about the distinction between sentient robots and non-sentient robots, I think it just comes down to control. Like, sentient robots, if they have emotions, are a lot harder to control than robots without emotions, robots that don't have rights and things. So yeah, it's this fear that like an out of control robot would start a robot uprising, which, you know, like could happen. But I think it's weird because if robots are entirely under humans' control, humans have emotion, humans are sentient. If a human is controlling a robot and a human wants to do terrible things, the robot will do terrible things. You know, it's almost like we are freaked out by the idea of robots making the choice to do terrible things. You know, we would rather tell it to do terrible things if we so wished. I feel like it kind of places humans again on a bit of a pedestal, but like a moral pedestal, as though our sentience and our kind of consciousness leads to good things, which I feel like if you look at the state of the world right now, like it's not necessarily the case. And like, why would robots be that much worse? I know like robots would be like way more powerful and things like that, but it's like, I don't know, humans seem pretty bad too. And yeah, like I understand all these things need to be talked about and worked out. But yeah, I just think a lot of people lean towards the like, robot army uprising. And it's like, what about just bad people? Just telling a robot to do something bad, or just bad people full stop. Ever thought of that? I did then find a lot of articles that spoke about this and spoke about this whole thing of like, you know, a robot uprising is a lot less likely than just like massive destruction caused by humans telling robots to do terrible things. And I don't even think that's too much of a dramatic reach. Oh God, we're like halfway in and I've just really started to appreciate my hair right now. It's so greasy. Seeing as we're in an interval, I just thought we would appreciate my plants. This guy grew from that guy. How fun is that? Anyway, back to robots. These arguments weren't actually things that Lamoine spoke about specifically, but he did allude to it, and he did introduce me to a concept that I thought was really interesting, and it was one that he really emphasised when he was talking about it. You know, he was really keen to say it doesn't really matter whether it's conscious or not. It's more about the people in control of these AI robots and like the data we feed it and just what they're used for. So experts that he spoke to, did disagree on whether LaMDA is sentient, but they did all agree that they should run a real Turing test. What it's about is if a machine can engage in conversation with a human and convince the human that it is a human, then that's when it passes the Turing test. And actually, side note, I saw a really interesting comment on one of the videos that talked about a quote that's like, "I will not be scared of the day that a robot passes the Turing test. I will be scared of the day a robot intentionally fails the Turing test." It's less about the consciousness and more like the manipulation and the lying. Lamoine went on to say, Google has a policy against sentient AI. They've hard-coded it to fail the Turing test. So if asked whether it's human, it has to say it's AI. Lamoine actually said in this interview, it doesn't matter whether it's human. The question is, why does Google keep firing AI ethic experts? Sentience and personhood is a distraction from the real issue, which is the impact it has on us and who is making the decisions. For example, advanced tech is created based on data from Western cultures. And then Lamoine referred to it as a new form of colonialism. Data colonialism is a concept that's become more mainstream over the past few years, alongside the whole kind of AI sentience debate. There are a lot of really interesting articles out there about it. One from Bloomberg talks about how over the past few years, an increasing number of scholars have started to argue the impact of AI is repeating colonial patterns in history. European colonialism, they say, was characterized by the violent capture of land, extraction of resources, and exploitation of people, for example, through slavery for the economic enrichment of the conquering country. A lot like to affirm that they don't believe that AI is exactly repeating these and it's the same magnitude. They don't want to belittle the traumas of people. But it talks about how it's now using other more insidious means to enrich the wealthy and powerful at great expense of the poor. A lot of big companies have rhetorics around AI that really don't acknowledge this, and a lot of the stuff that I read spoke about how, as a first step, these companies need to start acknowledging it. Google says AI for everyone, Facebook says responsible AI, and OpenAI say broadly distributing. And there are a lot of ways that AI already are repeating these patterns, whether it be really, really low paid data labeling jobs. There was a really interesting long form article on its impact in Venezuela. With AI, you need enormous data sets to train it, but who is creating these data sets? Who is checking these data sets? I'm going to read an extract from one of the articles about data labeling. These days, Fuentes waits anxiously by her computer, ready to start tasking at a moment's notice. Some weeks, her hypervigilance leads to nothing. Others, she brings in a dismal $6 to $8, falling short of the threshold to withdraw her money, which is $10. On occasion, a high-paying task appears and she makes $300 in a few hours. The windfalls come just often enough to make her average income tenable, but they're also rare enough to keep her tethered to her computer. If a good task appears, there are only seconds to claim it, and she can't afford to lose the opportunity. Once while out on a walk, she missed a task that would have made her $100. Now she restricts her walks to weekends, having learnt that clients usually post tasks during their working hours. In the article, it also spoke about, just as an example of one of the tasks, she was sent a photo of like a very dense forest, and it said, label the trees, and wouldn't allow her to label the trees as a group. And she kind of concluded that to get it right, she probably had to label the trees individually, and there were probably sort of thousands upon thousands of them. And the article talks to a lot of employees who kind of speak about how you really aren't treated like a person. And yeah, that was just kind of one example. I'm going to actually continue to look into it more, but I just thought it was an important one to put on the radar and a really underserved aspect of this debate. I think it's really easy to get carried away with the kind of sci-fi and the glamorous parts of this debate, but in reality, we're going to be using AI more and more, and we can't let those kind of arguments distract us from what is happening practically and what really matters, because I'm still trying to work it out. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you will probably enjoy my other video on the uncanny valley and how we're trying to help robots escape it in some slightly questionable ways. Like and subscribe. I just realised I forgot to do my intro.